صلى عليه الله ربي وعلى صحابه وآله ومن تلا. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد.
So the first narration is about how you understand marriage and finding a partner. It is narrated from Ahmed in his Muslim as well as Ibn Hibban in his Sahih with a good chain of transmission. عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يأمر بالباءة وينهى عن التبتل نهيا شديدا ويقول تزوجوا الولود إني مكافر بكم الأنبياء يوم القيامة. And the takhrij and a few notes that I will comment on are there as well. I will be reading the Arabic as well for those who understand Arabic, so they possibly can understand the connotations I will comment on as well. One special thing that I do want to focus on during this course is the points that you can pick up on through the linguistics of it, or just the ones that are ignored a lot of times. So the translation of this, Anas ibn Malik, he narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu used to instruct, يأمر بالباء. So a lot of times, بالباء is translated as marriage itself, right? But where does it really come from? Which is why I translated this as inclination towards women for marriage, right? You can just translate it as marriage as well, that he used to instruct that you get married, but there's this linguistic connotation that's lost on people that ba'a literally means sexual intercourse. And what's even more interesting is that it comes from ba'a yabu, or daw, which means to go back to something again and again. So, like, one thing you can understand here is that inclination towards women is something that is inseparable, and you will always go back to it. No matter how contained you are, how much you protect yourself, it's going to be temporal only. You will go towards women, right? So the Prophet يأمر بالباء. So not just marriage as an institution in a way that you get married and you eat and you drink and you sleep and then you have children and there's a jump there, but more focal or more focused on the sexual relationships part, بالباء, which is in contrast to وينهى عن التبتل. Tabattul, if you were to see the early writings of or the Arabic dictionaries, the early ones you would see, it refers to people who would refrain from marriage, not just as not married, but they would also castrate and do things to their private parts that would. That would disfigure their bodies in a way that they're no longer inclined towards females. So the Prophet ﷺ, he forbid that, not just in a light manner, but it says وَيَنْهَى عَنِ التَّبَتُّلِ نَهْيًا شَدِيدًا. That's why I chose this recension as well, because it very explicitly mentions that the Prophet ﷺ very strictly or sternly mentioned that you should not do things that make you go away towards or from women, disinclined to marry. So the two things that you pick up from this, the hadith itself, it could loosely be translated as the Prophet ﷺ commanded that you get married and then not abstain from getting married. But it says يأمر بالباءة, and al-ba'a is mentioned by al-Rakbi, who's a Yemeni scholar from the 7th Islamic century. He literally just mentions is a ma'na al-ba'a. He says shahwatun nisa. It's like to like women, right? So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that. And since it's understood that the only way to actualize that is through an Islamic marriage, right? This connects to marriage itself. So inclination towards women is not considered to be a negative thing in Islam. Al-ba'a, sexual intercourse, and being inclined towards it is not considered to be a bad thing or evil thing. It's actually an important part of marriage. And then he mentions وينهى عن التبتل نهيا شديدا ويقول تزوج الودود الولود. And the Prophet ﷺ used to say, like after this, Anas ibn Malik mentioned that he also used to say, in relation to whatever has been mentioned, get married to women who are very loving and very prolific in terms of giving birth. So this too is sometimes just translated as al-wadud is in the one that loves, and al-walud, the one that gives birth, contrary to someone who's not able to give birth. That is understandable as well. Another recension that I mentioned here from Abu Dawood, a riwayah is that mentions from Ma'aqil ibn Yasar, جاء رجل إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال إني أصبت امرأة ذات حسب وجمال. That I came across or I have found a female who is status and beauty, وأنها لا تلد, except that she is not able to give birth. Whatever was the method of, or the way he was able to find that out, but he did find out, and he mentioned that to the Prophet. And then he asked, there's a mistake in the Hamza over there, أَفَأَتَزَوَّجُهَا, is that should I marry her, the female that he's found who's beautiful and of a high status, but she does not give birth? قال لا. The Prophet ﷺ said no. ثم أتاه الثانية, المرة الثانية. Then he came to the Prophet ﷺ again, فنهاه, and asked her to marry that female, and the Prophet ﷺ said no. ثم أتاه الثالثة. Then the Prophet ﷺ then the person came to the Prophet ﷺ the third time. فقال صلى الله عليه وسلم, at that moment the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم told him, تزوج الودود الولود فإني مكافئ بكم الأمم. That marry the females, or you should marry females that are very loving, very prolific, or the ones who are, as Ibn Durayd mentions in the Jamhara, he defines al-walud as not just the one that is a famous linguist. He mentions kathiratul awlad, the one who's able to give a lot of birth, so you can have a lot of children with. And that is connected to what comes after, that is فَإِنِّي مُكَاثِرٌ بِكُمُ الْأُمَمِ, or the narration that we looked at, إِنِّي مُكَاثِرٌ بِكُمْ الْأَنْبِيَاءَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. That is because I want to, or I am, or I shall outnumber the prophets by you or through you on the day of judgment. And the ummah is going to be a lot more, it's going to be larger. It will have a lot many people compared to the ummahs of the other prophets. So the Prophet ﷺ, he wished that he wanted a larger ummah. So look at how this is connected to marriage. If you were to go back, you say that the Prophet ﷺ instructed in the beginning of this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ instructed, يَأْمُرُ بِالْبَاءَةِ. He mentioned that you should be inclined towards females, but in a halal way. There's nothing wrong with that, right? There's a misconception that people have that women generally is considered to be, like the term women is like a vice that everyone's supposed to just completely stay away from. So even that kind of spills over their engagement or involvement with halal forms of enjoying women as well, to the extent that it's understood as something that is making you turn away from God. But the Prophet ﷺ himself instructed us about to get married, as translated generally, or al-jima', and you should be inclined towards it. وَيَنْهَى عَنِ التَّبَتُّلِ نَهْيًا شَدِيدًا, and very strictly said that you should not refrain from going towards females by adopting different ways, because Islam has placed marriage for you as an option, not just an option that you can, I guess like as something you can do, right? Not necessarily just an option. ويقول تزوج الولود, and marry someone who loves a lot. So again, it's not just someone who's loving. فعول, as Abu Hayyan and others have mentioned as well in their respective writings, comes in the meaning of not exaggerate, like an intensity that is understood in the meaning of loving itself. Mawaddah means to love. And wadud is the one that loves a lot. Right? It's used for singular and plural, depending on the context. Here it's used in the meaning of plural. Obviously, al-walud, the one kathirat al-awlad, as Durayd mentions, the one that gives a lot of birth. So someone who's very loving towards you, very affectionate towards you, find that woman. And the one that is able to give you a lot of children, find that one. Now, obviously, for someone who's not able to give birth before there have been, like, if a female has not married before, then it's understood that you would not know whether she can give birth or not unless, of course, there's she goes to the doctor and then you find out that, okay, she cannot give birth, but usually that doesn't really happen unless a female's giving birth. So it doesn't really target or establish that you have to find a female and also confirm whether she can give birth or not, because the bikr, as many commentators of Hadith have mentioned, that it's already expected that she will give birth. A female that is not married before. As for someone who has married before and she did not give birth, this will be applicable to it, and as a form of preference, a man can definitely prefer a female in marriage who he knows can give birth. So if she has given birth before, that could be a form of preference for the male to approach that female. And in the mukathirun become al-anbiya yawm al-qiyamah. It was clear. So this hadith tells us about being inclined towards females, completely fine. Get married, find females that are loving. Love is an integral part of marriage. It's not something that is just there. And also having more children, a lot of children. As the Prophet ﷺ wants to outnumber the other prophets' nations. And that was clear. If you have any questions, inshallah, you can ask in the end. Sorry. The second hadith is about more focused on love in nikah or marriage, in Islamic marriage, right? It's narrated by Ibn Majah, that is عن ابن عباس قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يرى للمتحابين أو للمتحابين مثل النكاح. That it is narrated from Ibn Abbas رضي الله عنه, that the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم said, there is nothing like marriage for those two or those people who love each other. So, is it possible for someone to fall in love before marriage? 100%. Otherwise, this hadith makes absolutely no sense. In fact, there's a Abd al-Razzaq, he mentions with a sound chain, as you can see underneath that, عمر عن إبراهيم بن ميسرة قال خطب رجل شاب امرأة قد أحبته. There's more context that's given in that hadith. That a man who was young, he proposed to a female, قد أحبته. The female used to love him. Right? I mean, it's either you would say that, you knew from the female's part or after, later, whatever, but it doesn't really say that the man used to love her. It's very explicitly mentioned that the female used to love this man. Like him. Right? I think like it makes more sense in our context, right? She used to like him and he wanted to get married to her. He proposed about, but the family said no. Right? They're like, yeah. They're like, no, we're not getting you married to this guy. And she liked him. فسألت طاووس. So she went to Tawus. Tawus is one of the major or most prominent students of Ibn Abbas, right from the Salaf. She went to him and asked about this matter. It's really interesting because this is not the West and this is not the century. But this seems to be something that people would, at least in some circles, would frown upon quite a bit if a female comes and says that, well, there's a man who's proposed to me. And Sa'alat says, and Tawus is a scholar. The woman goes and mentions this to a scholar from the Salaf that there's a man that I like and he's proposed to me or my family. I think the family makes more sense because they're the ones who said no and they're refusing. So فقال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, he mentions at that moment that the Prophet ﷺ said لم يرى الامتحان مثل النكاح وأمرني أن أزوج. And then he mentioned this hadith, there's nothing like marriage for those two who love each other. They're both recensions, both riwayahs exist. That is for people who love each other or two people. But the two people is more emphatic, and this is something that I've heard from my teachers as well. So I'm just sticking to that. Those two who love each other. So Tawus mentioned this, opposing whom? Who is the woman opposing this? Her parents, her family. And this is strange. You find this in the writings of people that you would imagine that they were like what people are thinking, they would imagine that Tawus would probably say, you should be ashamed of yourself. Why did you even come and ask when your parents are telling you not to marry this guy? You should listen to your parents, right? It doesn't mean that he actually said that, well, go oppose your parents and get married on your own. He said he instructed her, or he told her, yeah, you should get married because you love him. And then he proposed. The parents or the family is not really right about this. So, I mean, it's kind of like not mentioned what happened after, what was the way to achieve it. But I would say in our cases, we would focus more on convincing the parents now, rather than saying that, let's just do it on our own or something. At that time, like the Hanafi view, obviously, it looks very tempting. And that too, if it's understood correctly, otherwise, usually it's not. But this is very interesting. So a few things that you understand from this is that it's possible on its own, it's not considered to be problematic. The process and the particulars related to how, of love itself may become problematic, but love on its own, or love or even liking someone before marriage, is not considered to be problematic. It's completely fine. For not just a guy to like a female, and you would imagine a female is emotionless. She just focuses on her studies and just does the stuff at home, and she would just wait for her parents to decide when she wants to get married and when she wants to get married and whom she's going to marry, right? No, it's possible that she likes a guy too. However it happened, right? It doesn't really mention that. It's not impossible for it to happen through halal means as well. There's a possibility that this person was, it doesn't really mention, but like maybe he worked for her father, right? So he would come around. Or he could be her cousin. That's ajnabi Islamically, right? Or it could be someone, I don't know, anybody. But it just happened, for sure. It's not considered to be problematic. There are people who have told me that they've spoken to scholars, and just the fact that they've mentioned that there was some sort of attraction or likeness, possibly love too, either of the sides, feel that itself is looked down at and treated very negatively. But that's not necessary. It's not something, but I'm not going to say that it's something that itself is offensive necessarily as well, but it's not also necessary that you have to do it in a way that's the Islamic way. Are you guys understand what I'm saying? Like if someone has a personal preference of like, okay, I do not prefer this, fine. It's understandable. But it cannot be understood as, oh, this is the only Islamic way, because this is narrated with a sound chain from Tawus, right? Like they were Muslim scholars as well. It should be tolerated that if a Muslim scholar facilitates a female's marriage, and females can also approach males, obviously, through the right means. As for the discussion about whether someone considers it to be appropriate in our times or not, is dependent on, again, their own personal preferences as well.
Is that the concept of chaperoning?
I think so to some extent, I think, but not, I mean, not necessarily with all the details as we understand it.
Just like gender.
Yeah, definitely. Like there is also, okay, but one point that you also take from this is that why is this female going to Taus and not her female friend? Right? That's one thing too, right? Like she's not crying and going to her female friend. She actually went to a scholar. Like because scholars need to be involved in these matters. Why? Because marriage is a religious institution. Like it's supposed to be viewed as a religious obligation or recommendation or process. Everything has to be looked at in a religious manner, and scholars are the ones who give you religious advice if you seek from them the religious advice. I hope that was clear. So this was, I think, this hadith was really important to understand that loving someone before marriage is not considered problematic. Love itself is very important for marriage, and if someone does fall in love or does like someone, it makes sense for them to get married. There are cases you would see that because parents are not agreeing, and what happens then? Well, some parents do not agree, and they just keep on. They're like in the convincing process for like 4 years. If that happens to be the case, in and of itself, it's not considered problematic. It's not a sin, major or minor, as long as you stay within the parameters of Sharia. So if, let's say that you like someone and they like you too, and there was nothing haram, there was none, right? There was no touching that happened. There was no khalwa, seclusion, or isolated meetings that happened, etc. All those things that are considered to be haram as a minor sin or a major sin, then it's completely fine to like someone. So imagine like something like how would you control this when the Sharia or the Hadith that comes with the Prophet ﷺ, when it allows or accepts to some extent that two people can be in love with each other, and the best thing for them is that they love, so they get married. Is it not a possibility for someone to fall in love with someone else and then not get married? Obviously there is, right? Like for those people who love each other, the best thing that they can do is get married. What if they cannot get married for some reason? There is a possibility. That does not mean that love or liking someone ends on its own. It's just normal. Now let me connect it back to, and sometimes it's hard to get rid of love, right? So how about an understanding or something that everyone talks about is that what if your partner liked someone else or even loved someone else, right? Both for females and males. And particularly this narration, the other one, Abdul Razaf, that I read, it talks about the female liking the guy. So imagine she went and she tried to convince her parents, and they did not agree. And the guy's like, well, I'm not waiting that long, and he got married to someone else. And she continues to like this guy. However, I mean, I don't know, like the science behind it, right? But obviously, it is possible for her to fall in love with someone else as well. Well, she might have some feelings for the previous guy as well. That is a possibility, right? That's not considered to be. I mean, if you have a personal preference that you want someone with a clean slate, that's you. But religiously, she doesn't have to come to you in a way that, well, you know what, even the thought of liking someone else or loving someone else that's not your husband is considered to be problematic. It's just being normal, right? If there's a previous relationship in a way that something haram was done, yeah, that's because of the fact that something haram was done, regardless of whether a relationship was there or not. So if, let's say that the male or the female, both, we're not talking about females only, if they just hooked up with someone, right? That could be something that you would say that, well, you know what, I'm not interested in someone who's done that. But just liking itself is not considered to be problematic. So if someone liked someone else, for whatever reason, right? And that didn't work out, and then they're like, we gotta get married, right? And then they started, you don't have to turn into a sad persona and just start like tweeting stuff. right? And get traction through that. You know, your heart was broken, so now you're just going to be like a sad man tweeting, right? But you can definitely, realistically speaking, you will move on. But there is, even after moving on, there is a possibility that the person might have feelings. So what I'm saying is that from both perspectives, say that because of the fact that because the hadith mentions the female, I would say that since I deal with men a lot more, men are more concerned about it than women are, right? And we will discuss obviously polygyny and other issues later on too. We'll discuss that later. But just in the context of the other recension, let's say that the female liked someone and she's trying to move on, but she's also realistic about it that this man's moved on and I want to get married to someone. There's nothing haram in that, in having feelings for that person. Obviously, she would, I mean, it makes sense that she would suppress it and not express that in front of her husband, but it's completely normal. It's completely fine. So the hypothetical, or I would say like the imaginative understanding that a lot of people have is that like a pure woman is the one that does not even think of a man ever, and she just focuses on cooking and studying, etc. And then you pop up through her parents' recommendation, and then she just completely falls in love with you, and she never thinks of another man. That's not necessary. It could happen though, right? But I don't know if that makes sense. That it has to happen. We will discuss polygyny later, but you know, from her perspective, if there is a man who is polygynist, who is married to multiple females, or is looking to get married to another female, obviously he will love both of them, right? Yeah, but that's gonna start a different discussion. But alhamdulillah, we understand this, that the Prophet, based on this narration, recognized people's love, did not consider it to be problematic on its own, rather instructed them that they should get married, right? There's another, in some Ibn Majah and some of the manuscripts of Ibn Majah, not the Sama' of it, not how it's been orally transmitted. Some of the manuscripts actually have, in place of the ya, it actually has let me see. In place of the ya over here. Sorry, well, everyone can understand. Let me yell, right here. Oh, I'm sorry. Right here, this part. Sorry. This part over here, it has been related as with the noon. Lam nara. From that, you understand that it's not just in terms of the concept, but also in terms of practice. Like, we did not, right? As like, we did not used to do this. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone has really like practiced it, that someone, you know, loved another person and then they got married. But just the fact that it gives you a little more info. Like we say, lam yura, like it was not seen. Lam nara, we did not used to, or we did not see. So you see, like it's more personal if you were to look at both transmitted things. The third hadith is a bit long. Inshallah, let me read it and translate it. It's narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. It says, عن عبد الله بن عمر أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: كلكم راع فمسؤول عن رعيته فالأمير الذي على الناس راع فهو مسؤول عنه. That each one of you is responsible, a responsible shepherd. So the reason why I've put like it in square brackets is because this could be understood both ways. The word ra'in could either refer to just someone who's responsible of things. It could also refer to someone who looks over sheep particularly, right? So responsible shepherd, I would say, right? Because the main point of this first sentence is that it is focusing, or it's giving an example that you can see that, okay, just as a shepherd looks over his flock, right? That's how you are also responsible or accountable for whatever you're responsible for, right? فَمَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, that he will be asked, literally accountable. So you have your duties and your responsibilities, and it's not just something that you will not be held accountable for later on, you will be, right? It's not something that you took upon yourself to do. It's something that you will be asked about later. So if someone says that, well, you know, I'm gonna do this, and they don't want to do it later, they just walk away, right? You have your own goal and you say, you know what, this is something that I'm going to be responsible for now. And then you just lose interest and you're like, well, I don't care anymore. And you walk away. There's no accountability. But there is a religious accountability related to these things. So the first example obviously does not necessarily have a connection, but what follows does. So there is an example that's brought that a shepherd and his flock, as there's accountability related or responsibility related to that, there's accountability related to that religiously speaking to in the hereafter, of course. فالأمير الذي على الناس راع. So the person who's a leader, or the leader is the one responsible over people, and he is accountable for those he is responsible. So whoever, the responsibility that he has, if he does something wrong related to the people that he was responsible for, there will be accountability for that in the hereafter as well. Right? Let's say that there is the difference between like responsibility here, like ri'aya and mas'ala, would be the fact that you do care about things or you're responsible for certain things, but maybe no one finds out when wrong was done, and there's no accountability. But in the hereafter, there will be accountability related to it. والرجل راع على أهل بيته وهو مسؤول عنه. And a man is also responsible for the people of his household, وهو مسؤول عنهم, and he is accountable for them. والمرأة, as narrated by Al-Bukhari rahimahullah, this is sometimes not present in some of the different riwayas, recensions of the hadith. And a female راعية على بيت بعلها وولده, is also responsible for the home of her ba'al, which means a husband, وولده, and his children, which is very interesting. I'll comment on this later, inshallah. Let's go to the translation first. وهي مسؤولة عنهم, and she will be held accountable in relation to them. والعبد راع على مال سيده وهو مسؤول عنه. A slave is also responsible for the wealth of his master, and he is held accountable for it. ألا, so know this, فكلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. Each one of you is responsible for things that were mentioned, and each one of you will be held accountable for it in the hereafter. The hereafter part is understood because there's a prophet giving religious guidelines to the people, right? رواه البخاري ومسلم واللفظ للأول وفي رواية محمد الموطأ. So Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan, he has his own recension of the Muwatta. In that, there is a slight addition with the same or similar chain of transmission. وامرأة الرجل راعية على مال زوجها. And a man's literally woman or wife is also responsible for the wealth of her husband. So everyone's responsible for their family. A lot of times this hadith is understood as the responsibility of the man in terms of nafaqah, etc. No, it's actually every right that relates to you as a man in the relationship and as a woman in the relationship. So the man is responsible for all the rights that are related to his wife, and the woman is also responsible for all the rights related to her husband. And whenever there's a violation, they will be held accountable for that in the hereafter. But for some reason, the ones related to a female are more explicitly mentioned. So Muhammad ibn Hassan's riwayah, or recension, another recension of the hadith, that mentions that the wealth of the husband is something that the female is going to be responsible for. So when the husband is not around, or when he is around, but there is spending that has to happen in a considerate manner, the woman will be held accountable for that. That makes sense? So if the husband is, let's say, obliged to spend a lot more than needed, and then he's lacking in some of the other responsibilities where he can spend, well, he is definitely doing something wrong, but she might also be, or may also be held accountable for assisting this process. So whose responsibility is for, let's say that a husband and a wife, whose responsibility is it to take care of the man's parents? It's the man's responsibility. It's not his wife's responsibility. So if he has, let's say, some money saved on the side to take care of his parents when they're in need, and he ends up spending that money in a something that makes his wife happy, for example, right? And she encourages that knowingly, there's a great chance that the person will be held accountable for that in the year after, right? The reason why I'm not really making like categorical statements is because everyone's situation is different, right? So, you know, how much is known, how much was the responsibility? There's a lot more context that's required to say very clearly, okay, at this point, you will be held accountable and you'll be held accountable too, right? Accountability is not like a loose thing that you just throw around on people, right? But subhanAllah, that's the case. One point so it's a reminder, this hadith, that everyone's responsible for the things that relate to their partners in marriage, and they're supposed to protect each other. And specifically, not just like in terms of what a man is supposed to do, specifically a female has been mentioned here too. It says that a female is responsible for the home of her husband. You know, the word ba'al here, the word ba'al, which means it comes in the meaning of ma'bud as well, more commonly actually. Al-Wahidi rahimahullah, he's mentioned this in his tafsir, one of his tafsirs. He mentions فذكر أهل اللغة أن معناه, that is the word al-ba'al, يأتي بمعنى المالك والسيد والرب. That the word ba'al, which is translated as a husband, which is a plural of it, comes in the Quran too, or تدعون بعلا, as Allah Ta'ala mentions, that do you call upon as a form of worship, ba'al, وتذرون أحسن الخالقين, and you leave or abandon the best of all creators. You call upon whom? تدعون بعلا, ba'al, the one that is worshipped. And Al-Wahidi rahimahullah mentions after that since it comes in the meaning of Malik, the owner, was Sayyid, the master, Warrab, the Lord, and he mentioned that this is the reason why the husband's called the husband too, which is quite interesting. And this hadith has it too. So there's this linguistic point that you can take from it, that it's not just your partner. I mean, I mentioned protecting your partner, but the partner that is in the place of your ba'al for the females, like your master. Not literally, does not own you, right? The female is not owned, but he's supposed to be treated like a king. I would say that's a better way to put it, right? I mean, she's supposed to be treated like a queen too, but by the king, right? So that's a good point, alhamdulillah. And the responsibilities that relate to, and the other point is waladi, is the fact that it doesn't say waladihima, their children. The child is attributed towards the father, his child, or his children, because the word walad comes in the ma'na of jins as well. There's a generic meaning as well, so children in general, to his children. So that doesn't mean that, you know, your children from your previous marriage, for example, for a female, let's say. So there was a female, she had a previous marriage, she had a child from their marriage, and then that child is not in the bait of the husband. That's not the husband's responsibility, right? If there is no like presence. Am I making sense or not? It's not the husband's responsibility. But if he does take care of that child, obviously, then that's a good thing too. But it should be appreciated by the female. And when she gives birth to the child of that man she's married to now, that is that man's child. So you cannot have both, right? As in, you get married to someone, you had a child with that man, and then you separated, and then you got married to another man, and you're like, well, since you're marrying me, you're not marrying me only, you're marrying this child too, because this is my child, right? And then you marry that man, and then you give birth to his child, and you go, well, you're responsible for this child because it's your child. It's either both of them are yours, or one of them is mine and the other one's not. Making sense or not? But the only thing is that it's not mandatory for females to earn and provide. It's the husband's or the ex-husband's responsibility to take care of the child as well. But if he's not able to do that, normally the mutahabban, you would imagine that the ones who love each other would support each other in all their goals. That is not just supporting the female, but also supporting whatever needs she has. That includes her previous child or her parents and other things. But what's important, what's noticeable here is وَوَلَدِهِ. There are other recensions that mention وَلَدِهَا as well, but that's obviously majaz. The most of the recensions mention وَلَدِهِ. That is the man's child, right? The next hadith is about, the hadith before was about marriage itself and how do you protect your partner from both sides, a male and a female. I would say, one of the reasons why the men's specifics are not mentioned here is because they're very inclusive. He does a lot, but the female, her responsibilities are not that many. They're accountable towards, her husband. So they've been mentioned specifically. The fourth hadith is عن سعد بن أبي وقاص قال لما كان من أمر عثمان بن مظعون الذي كان ممن ترك النساء. Oh, there's a typographical error here. بعث إليه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا عثمان إني لم أمر بالرهبانية. It is narrated from Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas that when the matter of Uthman ibn Maz'un, which is related to Tabattul, as I mentioned before, was that he to physically do something to your parts sometimes, or just choosing abstinence and not getting married to females, or Asceticism, as I've pointed out here. So it became known that he's someone who's going towards that path, right? بعث إليه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So the Prophet called for him or sent for him and said, "Oh Uthman, Ya Uthman, إني لم أمر بالرهبانية. I've not been instructed by God to observe asceticism, let's to refrain from females." Uthman radiallahu anhu, he replied, he asked him after that, رغبت عن سنتي, right? Are you averse to following my path, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? Because what became known of him that he's not going to be inclined towards females. So قال لا يا رسول الله. Uthman رضي عنه, not the famous Uthman bin Affan, it is Uthman bin Mad'un. He mentioned that no, I'm not averse to your path, following your path. So قال, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned إن من سنتي أن أصلي وأنام. That is from following my path is that I pray. So like what he's leaving behind or what he wants his Sahaba to do. That I pray وأنام, and I sleep. Opposites. وأصوم وأطعم, and I fast and I eat. The opposites. وأنكح وأطلق, and I get married and I separate or divorce with me. This is very interesting. This is within the fold of Sunnah. فمن رغب عن سنتي فليس مني. Whoever is disinclined to follow my Sunnah فليس مني. And what were the Sunnahs that are mentioned? أصلي وأنام, أصوم وأطعم, أنكح وأطلق. Based on this narration. يا عثمان إن لأهلك عليك حقا ولعينك عليك حقا. O Uthman, he mentioned that there is a right upon you for your family or for your wives, and there's a right upon your eyes for you too. Right upon you for your eyes as well. This is narrated by Al-Bukhari Muslim with a sound chain of transmission, as well as Al-Darimi with a sound chain. And Ahmad rahimahullah, he also has another narration in which it's mentioned لكني أصوم وأفطر وأصلي وأنام وأمس النساء فمن رغب عن سنتي فليس مني. So there's another narration that comes in which it's mentioned that Abdullah ibn Amr, he's the one who actually went to the Prophet ﷺ, or he was called, by the Prophet ﷺ when He got married to a female and he had same inclinations. He got married and he has same inclinations, which is really important to understand here. It's not that a person saying that, well, you know what, I do not want to get involved with women. And it's general terms, and its most general way of looking at it, right? He actually, and this is too, said, the Prophet ﷺ said, وَأَمَسُّ النِّسَاء, and have intercourse with females. So what happened with him is, as written by Ahmed and also Bukhari and others, is that there are two different narrations. Uthman had the same situation, and Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As had the same situation too. So it's related from him that he got married and he spent the whole night without having sexual relations. And the next day, someone asked his wife, "How is he? Okay, how's your husband? What do you think about him?" Well, she was like, "He's a nice guy, but like he did not really engage. He didn't really do much. In fact, the words that I used were وَلَمْ يُفَتِّشْ كَنَفًا. That is, he did not really get intimate with me in a way that there's, as mentioned by many commentators, لَمْ يَكْشِفْ سَتْرًا. Like he did not, what's a good way to translate that? لَمْ يَكْشِفْ سَتْرًا, يعني he did not openly have sexual relations with me after. Like he was not open sexually. That's what it means. So sometimes, I've seen this hadith being mentioned was a nikah, and like we're talking about the contract, right? But this hadith is more focused on the fact that abstinence does not mean that, well, you got married, and then you know how some people have a beard, you have that kind of beard, right? It's just like you got a woman, but you're out and about, away from that female for a long time, right? Maybe if it's a necessity, it's understandable, but it happens quite often. And I'm not sure, Allah knows, everyone's got their private lives, but it's definitely not something that, well, if a female can complain on the first night, there's a possibility that she might complain after 2 months as well, right? So that's something that's really important to understand in this hadith, that it's not just asceticism in the sense of like, well, you have the act or the contract of nikah or not. It's actually in terms of engaging sexually too. So the other wording that comes is amas. And the other riwayah of al-Bukhari that supports his meaning is that فَإِنَّ لِجَسَدِكَ عَلَيْكَ حَقًّا, that your body has rights over you too. Yeah. And we'll stop here, inshallah. We'll continue after the adhan. Yeah, so the questions that both from the male side and the female side, you can, inshallah, make short Q&A in the end. Those are the questions at that time, inshallah. So just to a few things about the last hadith. The hadith that is hadith 4. The last part that we're doing, right? That is, so everyone was understanding the point that I made. That in this hadith particularly, we cannot cover it, holistically in a way that every single benefit will be covered from this hadith. Hopefully, this hadith keeps coming again and again for everyone in their lives. But just a few pointers that I had to discuss, especially when it relates to things that are, considered to be our normatives, right? So, like, there is a negativity related to discussions on sexuality, marital relationships or sexual relations or intimate relations in a marriage, etc., in the process of it, etc. So the point that I was making in this hadith is that it's not really just focusing on wahdaniyya. Asceticism is not deemed as whether you get into wedlock with all the responsibilities related to you as a husband or between you and your wife. It's actually about being sexually involved in your marriage or not, right? It's not to go away from whatever the prophetic understanding of asceticism is not just by having wedlocks and having children too. You need a happy marriage or happy, or more so like a marriage in which the rights, sexual rights of your partner is also fulfilled, because it works both ways, right? Just as males are not supposed to stay without females, females are also not supposed to stay without males. So when they get married, and that marriage is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the focal point in that was to make you go away from tabattul, that is when you stay away from women, but not as just mere companions, but companionship plus intimacy. That's really important. So when you look at, I still remember there was in one of the a good friend of mine who worked at a Dar al-Ifta for a very long time, for about 7-8 years at that time. This was about 5 years back, and he still works for a Dar al-Ifta. So I used to go and meet with him quite often, and we used to talk about the recent issues that he's dealing with in terms of writing fatwa. So one of the days I was with him, he had his own booth, so I used to just go there, talk to him. One of the issues that he told me is that today I met a man who has not been intimate with his wife for the past, I don't know, a year or two, he mentioned. So the fatwa that was supposed to be given was his wife came and she wanted separation because of this fact, but the question comes out, how come she didn't really say anything about it? It's because she felt that Islamically it's wrong to speak about these matters. You might think that this is something that's not prevalent, but just as you have a social, like certain social constructs, and then you have layers of them or influences of them, and you might not be affected by it directly, but there's a possibility that you might be affected by its different layers, right? Or just be affected by it in a way that you don't even realize. Does that make sense? So, for example, like if you're, there's this thing, someone was speaking to me from EFT, and they were mentioning that EFT has certain, like there's a special way of our demeanor that certain students have. So before they graduate and after they graduate, or like before they got into the university and after they graduated, their tones happen to be, this is what this person mentioned to me. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but their tones are very different in that they're more inclined towards liberalism. So I asked him, is it only related to UFT, or it's other universities affect them too, but UFT more particularly, right? Maybe the campuses are slightly different from what your surroundings are. I'm talking about the St. George. So, but they don't realize that, right? From that person's understanding, as well as I think another understanding you might see that people who go through traditional learning for years, the way they speak can change too a little. There are more terminologies that they might be using and they might not realize when they speak to the common folk or the common people who have not become, not in terms of their levels, etc., but they're just people who are not involved, not interested. The way they speak changes too. English, Arabic, any language they're speaking. So there is a possibility that someone gets affected by that too. What I want to talk about, the fact that there is these pockets that exist, at the very least, even though I personally have faced it and seen it myself, that there are people who believe that talking about sexual relations or anything that's considered to be something that is not within the fold of haya. But the haya is not haya shar'i, it's haya that is urfi. It's their conventional way of looking at the haya, right? Like modesty. It's a conventional understanding. It's not necessarily the Prophet's understanding. So the hadiths that we covered too, you would see that this hadith is particularly targeting sexual intercourse. And that happens through marriage only, right? So if you don't really go through the different ways it's been related, you might end up thinking that it's only talking about like getting a wedlock and then starting a family. But the focus over here in this hadith was not just that, that comes with marriage as well, but it's actually the abstinence or the asceticism that's being targeted as something that the Prophet said, or كان ينهى عنه نهيا شديدا, that he told to refrain from, was the one that is, you do not become someone who's just inclined to engage sexually with their partners, right? There's nothing wrong with that. As for the story that I was mentioning about my friend, he said that, well, this is not something that I'm going to passively worry about until I speak to the husband. And then the husband came over and he's advised him, and he's like, okay, maybe, we'll make things better later on. I didn't follow up like what happened later. But there are a lot of instances like that. Alhamdulillah. So this is the point that I wanted to mention. That is the fact that the other narration mentions, literally, what does it mean? I touch females. Or, like non-literally, like there's some form of majaz, would be considered to be having sexual intercourse. Right? Mas comes in the meaning of sexual intercourse too, but both of them involve physical touch. So it's not the wedlock. You pay a mahr and then have sexual intercourse once, and then you just have children, and then you're like, now I can go back to my life. Right? It's about that. And the other narration that I mentioned before of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, was about also, related to this, was when he actually did that, and it was not looked in a good light. Like it was mentioned very clearly by the female that this person, that this person did not really engage with me physically. The other thing that I would also point out before we move to the last hadith, and then the Q&A, inshallah, is that you see the two opposites that I mentioned here? They're both considered to be within Sunnah. Right? A very rigid understanding of what's the path or the way of the Prophet ﷺ is a lot of times that this is the way it is, and there's no other way of looking at it. Right? The thing itself. But the rigidity is kind of like, it doesn't make sense when you look at it, even the opposites being associated with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So what does that mean? When you say that, no one has problems with these two things. But if you sleep at the time of praying, and you pray at the time of sleeping, that's what's being targeted here. Because in another narration, or the more detailed version of it, it was actually asked, the Prophet asked him, do you pray at night? He's like, yeah, every night. And is he fast in the morning? Is he fast in the morning? So that's what it means. Particularly the fact that, well, I also sleep. I pray and I sleep. So during the day, I would pray. At times in prayer, I would not sleep. And at night, I would choose to pray or not. So the act of sleeping itself, and the act of praying itself, they're both considered to be here. Sunnah. It's just the placement of it. The placement has to be looked at from not just the general instructions of the Prophet ﷺ, what he has instructed about those different things and how they're supposed to be placed. They're also supposed to be looked at from your own circumstances. Like, where do you stand in all those things? Does that make sense or not? And if you were to look at the vastness in the Sunnah itself, because this part, if you were to take it literally, that everything that is assigned as a Sunnah, someone who goes away from it or is averse to it would automatically be considered to be problematic. فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي, this person is not from me, like he's not a part of me, etc. However you interpret it, it would not make sense, because that would require that every Sunnah is mandatory. Right? Isn't it? But when you look at the fact that opposites can be assigned or be understood as Sunnahs, you would say there would be certain Sunnahs that you don't really do in your entire life, which is amazingly understood from what follows, that is, وَأَنْكِحْ وَطَلِّقْ, that I get married in a divorce. Is it a Sunnah for someone to give divorce? Yes, it is. But is it mandatory? Absolutely not. Someone can live a life without, any divorce at all. He's not divorced anyone. We will discuss the hadith about, what's the correct understanding about divorcing, etc. later on within the 40 hadiths. But right now, what I'm pointing out is that the Prophet ﷺ has divorced, right? And that will generally fall under the parameters of the sunnah. It's just the placement of it and your own circumstances. So you would see your own life, let's say that someone has a valid right to divorce someone or not, or seek divorce or not. In that case, it will make sense for it to be sunnah. But then there's also a possibility to look at it, well, it's not really mandatory, it's not even maybe recommended, it's only permitted. But is it still a sunnah or not? It is. So the sunnah things, generally the way you understand this hadith, but only ma'an sunnati, you cannot understand it as like only those things that are mandatory. The context itself does not support it. Because it says, وَصَلِّ وَأَنَامْ أَصُومُ وَأَطْعِمْ وَأَنْكِحْ وَأَطَلِّقْ. The last part particularly. The other parts, people they were like, well, you know what? Yeah, like praying and sleeping, but you can actually oppose it. You can actually stay up and pray every single night. In fact, Ibn Abdin, rahimahullah, in his Hashiyah on Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar, he actually mentions that anything that's prayed after Salat al-Isha automatically falls under the Hajj. Anything that's prayed after Salat al-Isha. And according to the correct understanding, and this might be disputed a little, but I agree with it, that even the sunnah that is prayed right after, that will also fall under the Hajj. Does that make sense? And it's really interesting because it's usually a point that's made by those people who would say that since Salatul Witr is performed right after, and the hadith that mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ used to pray tahajjud and then for Qiyam al-Layl, obviously terminological difference, and then he would pray Salatul Witr, that is fulfilled because of the sunnah that was prayed. So they would say, okay, the two sunnahs that are prayed, and then the Salatul Witr that was prayed. So that is on the level of staying up and performing that prayer, the reward, the tahajjud. But let's say that someone does not, is tahajjud considered to be mandatory on any level? No, it's not. Not just in terms of reward, like in terms of specifics. That you would say that, okay, a person has to sleep and then wake up, tark al-hujud, right? Like you have to leave, sleeping at night. And then, the opposite of it, like you sleep and then you wake up, right? So, is that mandatory? What if someone does not pray tahajjud his entire life? There's absolutely no sin. There's no sin whatsoever because it's a recommendation. But you would say, it would not be equivalent to that person. Especially according to the majority of the scholars who consider sunnah and mustahab to be the same. Right? So the point I'm making is that here the opposites are being called sunnah. You cannot do both of them at the same time for sure. Can you choose one and not do the other? Yes. The reason why you cannot do the usalli wa anam is because the fact that prayers are mandatory due to other proofs. But you can actually stay, if a person stays up all night, chooses to stay all night, but it's perfectly fine, hypothetically. Right? Let's say that he stays up all night, and it's perfectly fine. You can consider it to be a karama, etc. But if he does that, would it be required for him to purposely sleep? Because فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي? No, it would not. That you would understand that, okay, you would sleep and not have a burden upon yourself. So anyone who feels burdened, he would say, yeah, this is what the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned to us. So the understanding of sunnah is very vast. Plus, you throw in the terminologies. Some scholars differentiate between sunnah and mustahab. Some scholars do not differentiate between the two. So it gets a bit unclear. A regular person just goes well, it's a sunnah, so you gotta do it. In fact, I spoke to a brother once and we were talking about something and I said, that's a sunnah. He's like, yeah, عندنا السنة واجبة. I'm like, what does that even mean? He goes according to عند الأصوليين السنة ليست واجبة وعندنا واجبة. He was from a Hadith background. So he said that according to the Usulis, because I said that according to the Usulis, it's not. He said according to the Usulis, the Sunnah I know is not wajibah, but every Sunnah is. I'm like, every Sunnah is wajibah. He's like, yeah. That doesn't make sense. It means you have to divorce a female before you die. Right? Because if someone were to say, well, that's not necessarily a sunnah, it comes explicitly in the hadith. وَأَنْكِحُ وَطَلِّقْ. It's a sunnah for someone, you would say that he, at one point, it can actually become mandatory. Let's say that he's doing dhulm on a female. And the female's like, well, I'm not going, getting a khulr, you leave me. Right? And he just goes like, oh, here, I'll just go find another one. Right? Or some other scenario specific to him, there is a possibility that he's now fulfilling the female's rights. And then it will become mandatory on him. But there are always external reasons. It's not the fact that it's the sunnah itself. Does that make sense? Over here, what's being understood is like the life of the Prophet is observed, and you take a lesson from it. Not the particulars. There are certain sunnahs you can choose. Certain sunnahs you choose to leave. Depends on like how emphatically it was related. Right? If there's an emphatic one, then there's a discussion about whether how much can you leave of it and how much not. But there's no such thing in an absolute manner that if you consider it to be sunnah, then automatically it has to be done. Am I making sense or not? It's better to do it, right? But there are certain forms that are, you cannot even say that are better to do it. Like talaq. There's a good hadith to understand that. And I'm sure that, no one's going to take from this that what's being said as like, in a nutshell, what's being said is that sunnah should not be followed, right? That's not what's being said. But sunnah itself means the path of the Prophet. Obviously, we follow the path. I'm talking about how do you follow the path. And in those paths, certain things are done that are not necessarily followed, right? Not everything that has been related from the Prophet is automatically a sunnah that needs to be done, right? The fifth hadith comes from Abdul Rahman bin Yazid bin Qais al-Nakha'i. This is really interesting too. So let me just read it. He says, Abdul Rahman, he mentions, دخلت مع علقمة والأسود على عبد الله. So I entered upon Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that is, with علقمة al-Aswad. وقال عبد الله, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, رضي الله عنه, who's a very famous companion of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, he mentioned, كنا مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم شبابا لا نجد شيئا. We used to be with the Prophet ﷺ and we did not have anything. لا نجد شيئا. What does that mean? Anything. That includes wealth. Right? And we were young. As-Sakhawi and others, they pointed out some recensions that are, that kind of point out towards the fact that, it could be also wealth that you get the benefit of, but I'm not going to mention that. But it's definitely understood in it, within the folds of it. So we had nothing as well. We could not find anything. فقال لنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يا معشر الشباب. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم then said to us, this is Abdullah telling whom? Alqamah and Al-Aswad and Abdul Rahman. Right? It's just a gathering, because there's another one. It seems like Abdullah used to keep on repeating the hadith. So he said that young people, من استطاع الباء فليتزوج. So I already commented on this, that Al-Rakbi as well as Ibn Abi Khayr in Al-Bayan, his commentary on Al-Muhadhab of Shirazi, like An-Nawawi has a commentary, he has a commentary too from the Shafi'is. They all mentioned that the ma'na of al-ba'a is jima', sexual intercourse. Right? So whoever is able to perform sexual intercourse, فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ, he must get married. فَإِنَّهُ يَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ وَأَحْصَنُ لِلْفَرْجِ, because it's something that allows you to protect your eyes from looking at not women in general, because everyone's supposed to be married. Right? So, in Ibn Khayr, Al-Rakbi, he mentions that it's something that is أغض للبصر. Why are the eyes particularly mentioned here? Is because the person is protected from the من أن ينظر إلى امرأة غيره. Is that so he's not looking at other at other men's females. Everyone's supposed to be married, right? So the female is looking to get married, and the man or the males are looking to get married too. So it's kind of understood that your social or your environment in a way that, it's either your woman or someone else's. So you would not, no one's supposed to stay unmarried. So either they're in the process or not. It's very interesting when I read this. I'm like, that's very interesting. Like he says, that the person looks at someone else's wife, right? Because that's either the woman is going to be someone else's wife, or it's your wife. That's how they're looking at it. And وأحصن الفرج, and you're able to protect your private parts. ومن لم يستطيع فعليه بالصوم. And whoever is not able to do that, then that person should take up fasting, start fasting. فإنه له وجاء, because fasting is وجاء. What does وجاء mean? Literally, وجاء means, or sometimes is, the linguists or Arabic experts, they mention it to be رد الأعضاء, that refers to just crush your body parts. So there was a process, وجاء, like a type of castration, in which they would hit their private parts and destroy their veins, and their stimulation would be less, not completely castrated, similar to it, right? And they would just hit their private parts until it's something that they would. It's strange because like, why would someone do this? But they were like, okay, if you don't find a woman, you could do this. Right? So, but the reason why I'm pointing this out is because the song was called this, and a lot of times it's like a way to protect yourself. But the word that was used, right, it's not a positive word. It's like your alternate to that. Like it's not necessarily a positive thing. That you don't want to get married, you can fast. It's like, okay, so I got a 10-year plan. I'm going to fast for 10 years. That's not what it means, right? Because it's not necessarily mentioned here positively. It's that you take up fasting until you can get married. Am I making sense or not? Wajah over here, sometimes translated as like castrating or gelding, I guess, right? It's like a process when a person hits his, or I would not say her, I would say his private parts, to the extent that the veins are no longer functional, and rad is like to crush, and they would not remove it necessarily. They would just go to mutilate their body. The mutilation of your body is not permitted. You cannot harm your bodies, right? وَإِنَّ لِجَسَدِكَ عَلَيْكَ حَقًّا, came in the hadith that your body has right over you. You cannot do that. So song is the replacement that came for that. So there were, I said before Islam, there were normal people who got married, and there were those people who did not get married to mutilate their bodies through castration, etc. Right? So Islam replaced that. I mean, they had forms of nikah that were not accepted by Islam. So Islam like sorted them out and had only specific types remaining. And in the replacement of castration or gelding, etc., was fasting. So you take from this that fasting is always considered to be a temporal help for you. Does that make sense? Then it makes sense too, because from just a physical perspective, that you don't eat much, you don't drink much, and you do not have sexual intercourse, and you stay away from those things. And there are many makruhat, things that are disliked, and they're usually the ones that encourage you to indulge in one of these three things, right? So you stay away from everything. It's kind of like no, or you're supposed to be at least, and then you're more in control. But that's not the normal way of living your life. So if you connect it to the hadith that was mentioned before, I fast and I eat. Not that you go like, well, I got to keep on fasting to control myself. And then some days you would not, because you cannot fast every single day. So, this whole thing that's been made, or like the middle ground that's found by people, as in they believe that getting married is mandatory, but there's a process, and that process is not really it's not really a real process. I'll just say that, Islamically speaking. It's what's been created by conventions. So it's all conventions. So you say, well, that's my goal and my studies are going to be interrupted, etc. None of that is actually mentioned in the hadith. The hadith very clearly says that whoever is able to get married, that is al-ba'a, literally perform sexual intercourse, فليتزوج. This hadith, man istita'a al-ba'a فليتزوج, some of the scholars have used this hadith as evidence that a female, if she were not to have, I mean, there are many narrations that support this meaning, but if she does not have her sexual rights fulfilled after marriage, she can seek separation because it's one of the main things in marriage. Right? So whoever is able to do that, he should be getting married. Who's not able to do that, it's understandable that that person will not get married. Right? If there is some physical issue to do, which he's not able to get married. This is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, and this is the wording of Bukhari. Another riwayah of Muslim is mentioned from Al-Qamah. He says, قال كنت أمشي مع عبد الله بمنى. I was with Abdullah, saying Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. I was walking with him near or with Mina. فلقي عثمان. So Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anhu, one of the four caliphs, he met him. فقام معه يحدثه. And they just stood together and they were like talking. Abdullah and Uthman. فقال عثمان يا أبا عبد الرحمن. So Uthman said to him, to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, mentioned his kunya, ألا نزوجك جارية شابة? Should we not, get you married to a young girl? To Abdullah. Right? لعلها تذكرك بعض ما مضى من زمانك. It's like maybe she's going to remind you of like the past times that are like gone for you. A little bit. بعض, right? قال فقال عبد الله رضي عنه, he actually goes like, let me mention the hadith. So لئن قلت ذاك لقد قال لنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم سواء. You know what? You mentioned this to us. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned to us, يا معشر الشباب, and he mentioned the same hadith. So we mentioned this again and again. Whenever the marriage topic would come, this would be mentioned. Which is why in the books of fiqh you would see that this hadith is so important that whenever they talk about marriage, they go like, yeah, marriage established from the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Ijma', and they mention this hadith. Always. That's the first hadith they mention. Because it's like so emphatically telling you that whoever is able to have sexual intercourse, that person should get married or must get married, because the amr itself. Now, inshallah, we're going to conclude our class in the Q&A too. But just the last point, that there's a discussion about, whether marriage is obligatory or not on people, and what are the different views about it. The majority of the scholars are of the view that there's no wujub for it in and of itself, right? And as Ibn Qudama mentions in Al-Mughni, it says, وَقَوْلُ عَامَّةِ الْفُقَهَاءِ. It says that generally speaking, or the majority of the fuqaha, they are of the view that marriage in and of itself is not considered to be mandatory. So فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ over here, even though literally translated as must, but it's not an obligation, like in its totality. But there are situations where it could become obligatory, which we'll discuss in the future class, inshallah. And we go more into like the rulings related to marriage itself. This class was more focused on how do you understand marriage, and in general, like sexuality and people loving each other. So just to recap before we move on, is the first hadith was about finding a partner, and the Prophet ﷺ's inclination towards, or instructing us to be inclined towards finding partners, finding females, finding males, and severely or intensely condemning or prohibiting or forbidding staying away from females, or the opposite of it, obviously, because the females would stay away from males as well. That is, everyone's supposed to get married. And he used to say, تزوج الودود الولود, and find those females and get married to them who are going to love you a lot, and they will bear you a lot of children. And the Prophet ﷺ wanted the ummah to be massive through these processes. And second narration was from Ibn Abbas, in which it is said, لا يرى لمتاح الدين مثل النكاح فتح الدلال. That is, for those people who fall in love, those two who fall in love, nothing is better than, or nothing is as good as marriage. So the institution of marriage, or the concept marriage in Islam is that if anyone falls in love, get married. The third hadith was about responsibilities. كلكم راع فمسؤول عن رعيته, based on this recension. Otherwise, كلكم مسؤول عن رعيته comes to, that is, each one of you is responsible and you will be held accountable for the rights in marriage. So marriage is not just falling in love and finding a good partner and being inclined towards females. There are also responsibilities connected to it, and not just from the male side, but also from the female side, right? The female side is what المرأة راعية على بيت بعلها, and the point that I mentioned about Ba'al as like her Lord, right? And then the hadith after was about the fact that abstinence, or asceticism is not part of Islam. You're supposed to be inclined towards females in terms of both marriage and sexual intercourse after marriage. This is looked at positively, right? And the Prophet ﷺ gave himself as an example. So don't consider the prophetic engagements with female to be specific, right? They go, well, that's how the Prophet was. No, the Prophet ﷺ himself is mentioning, he's like, to Uthman, he asked him, he said, أَرَغِبْتَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي? Are you going away from, my path? And what was his path based on another recension? He said, وَأَمَسْتُ النِّسَاء, I have sexual intercourse with females. Right? So why are you not doing that? Isn't it? So it's not religiosity to stay away from sexual intercourse at all. At all. There's no such signification that can be found that is not applicable to any other thing as well. There's no specific that focus on sexual intercourse. And also the haqq that relates to it, as well as the sunnah thing that we touched on a little. And lastly, the hadith about the youth getting married. And even though it is said, شَبَابَ لَا نَجِدُ شَيْئًا, the Prophet ﷺ looked at their state and it said that, well, as for the understanding that comes, مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ الْبَاءَ فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ, so it's a lot of times translated correctly so, because I'm kind of like picking it apart, right? Explaining things. I'm not saying the other translations are incorrect necessarily. It's that whoever is able to afford to get married, he should get married, right? But you're missing out, from the Arabic of it, you're kind of missing out. It's like what it literally says: whoever is able to have sexual intercourse must get married. And the part before it says, "Shabab la najid shay'ah," right? There's a narration in An-Nasa'i, his Sunan, as well as Tirmidhi mentions too. That is, there are 4 or 3, depending on the recensions. There are 3 people for whom Allah Ta'ala has promised that He will assist them. Right? He will assist them. And one of them is An-Nakih alladhi yurid al-'afaf, is the person who is interested in getting married or is getting married just to keep himself chaste. And chastity is, as we defined before, right? So that I have sexual intercourse, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do it with the females that I'm married to. And you should not turn away from this. You should be on my path. This is my path to engage in these things. And that hadith mentions, comes with its own chain. The hadith mentions that anyone who wishes to do that, so some Sakhawi, as I mentioned, they've connected it to the fact that what if you don't have enough money? They go like, well, all you need is mahar and maybe some adjustments, and then the money comes after. I mean, it might not come after necessarily, but the constant barakah, again, this is circumstantial, right? For a lot of things, you would see people, I've seen people who are struggling in certain things that they do for the sake of God. Is it not? They would start a mosque and they're struggling, but they go like, it's for the sake of Allah, inshallah, there's barakah in it. But when it comes to marriage, all of a sudden you have like a non-Muslim practical understanding of it. It's like, well, it doesn't make sense. It's like, yeah, do it like the way of the Prophet, isn't it? And it's kind of a difficult thing to say, because then I get like people contact me and they're like, well, what are you telling people related to us? You're telling me like, stop studying and stuff. I'm like, no. It is unfortunate, but the fact is that our social understandings, or our society, or the sub-society that we have, is not really supportive of this. So if they understand the fact that, okay, it's it's a sunnah, it falls under whatever, so you have so much emphasis on the way you have your headgear, to the extent that you're defining people's manhaj based on that, right? But or like talking about like whether he's right or wrong or whatever, right? If he wears this imama, in one place where I was teaching, I had an imam on, a Syrian one, and some of the people, they left the class because they thought I was Shi'i. I was like, how does that make sense? I asked someone, like, they're like, because the person that was the major Shi'i figure in their village is from in the East, he used to wear the same thing, so they thought, he or she. I'm like, I'm sitting here covering, Hadith text written by a Sunni scholar. You were there, right? So, it's within the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to understand the importance of marriage and get married, and assistance comes from Allah directly, and Allah makes people the means. So we should understand from this too, the last point, inshallah, that we're supposed to assist other people too. We should be assisting. Some of the hadiths we'll discuss later. We should be assisting other people too in their marriages, just as we assist someone who goes like, "Well, let me start a mosque," and someone goes like, "Well, you know what? I want to help other people doing good." This is one of the good things that people can do, and a lot of people are not able to do it because they're like, we have financial issues, and it just keeps getting delayed. So they just stay as a mutahabban for like a long time. That is even more problematic than people who are not. Which is understandable, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned they should get married, is because someone who does not have anyone that they're interested in, I would say that it's still easier for that person to stay away from sin. But let's say that people are interested, both sides, there's always this spark of like meeting up and be like, we're just gonna grab coffee, we're not gonna do anything. And there's like, well, anyone left, right? So it doesn't make sense, get married, right? And it's not a new thing for parents to oppose women liking some guys, or vice versa. It's completely fine. Inshallah, let's stop there. Inshallah, anyone has any questions, either they can send in the group, the Telegram group, but if you're not comfortable, you can ask here too if you're comfortable. Yeah.
So the correct understanding of fasting is to fulfill the purpose of, like you said, hijab. So with that, it's not really casual fasting occasionally, right? It's like continuously fasting until you feel so weak that the desire is gone.
Yeah, like you cannot. The thing is, like, even though it's like linguistically understood as such, it's hard to draw such like hard lines, I guess, straight lines, and be like, well, it's not this, it's this. What I'm picking up on is like the word that was used. You're like, wajah, this specific word was used. So let's say that there's no background whatsoever, right? Like you have certain backgrounds, that's why things make sense to you. Like you've heard it since ever. You're like, yeah, like, actions are with intentions. That makes absolutely no sense to someone who has no background. So if you speak to converts, right? Someone who's at the verge of converting, they're like, what does that mean? Actions are with intentions, obviously. Like whatever you do is going to have some intention there, right? Like, why is it stating the obvious? I mean, it makes sense when we discuss, like, hey, what does it refer to? Kamal al-a'mal or sihat al-a'mal. But we have already understood, like, yeah, certain things we're supposed to look at intentions. We grew up like this. It's usually the first hadith that we've heard, right, as Muslims. But someone who's comes with a clean slate, they don't understand that. We've heard this hadith a lot of times. And it's come with the context with, like, well, it's something that protects. And that did protect. So it's a right way to translate it. But like you missed out this point that you pick up on the Arabic of it. It's like, where does the word hijab come from? Go check Lane's or any other dictionary. It's going to talk about hijab as like, well, people just completely crushing their private parts. You're like, what? What's the connection? So the commentators, they explain. You go like, just the whole law. It was like to crush something, just as that process was done by people in the past. That's the replacement that Islam gave you. You understand from that, it's like, okay, those people were not doing that because that was the ideal way of living your life. Ideal people were doing it as like, well, you know what, we'll get married and have women. We can choose not to have intercourse even when we have women. And we can choose to have intercourse when you have women. There's those people who go like, well, I don't have money, nothing, what am I supposed to do? Is just get castrated. It'll be fine. So okay.
So not getting married was considered like an abnormality.
Yeah.
at that time. So this is a solution for that abnormality.
It's like the lower level solution of it. So the reason why I pointed this out was not that fasting in itself. It's correct. Obviously, you're rewarded for that, and you are following the instruction of the Prophet. So it's considered to be not the ideal way of living your life, right? So it's something that is it's something replacing a non-ideal way of life too. So otherwise, it doesn't make sense, right? Like it should not be. There's no optionality that's established here. Is the point I'm making? That I go like, well, you know what? You have two choices: either you get married now, or you get, even though like the obligation is negated, obviously. So you're not constantly. I said that it's circumstantially understood. Some aspects of a lot of things, right? There is a possibility that someone can be sinful because they're negligent of the fact that they should be married and they're committing sins, and they're just indulging more and more. But what if someone is like at the verge of it? He's like, I want to get married right now. He's like, okay, find a girl. Got a girl. He's like, well, do you have money? He's like, yes. He's like, okay, then everything the parents they agree. He's like, yes. He's like, what's the other issue? He's like, well, sponsoring her. Sorry? Hypothetically. He's like, we're still waiting for something went wrong in the documentation and six months more. Right? So he does have the possibility of just be like, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. If he goes like, well, you know what, I'm not waiting that long, I'm getting married. Completely fine. He also has the possibility to be like, well, until I get my objective, maybe I'll just do some crushing on my right? And let me just fast. It's a temporal solution. So alhamdulillah, we should have husn al-dhan in terms of like everyone that we're dealing with, and everyone does that too. But it's not a thing of like, well, you know what, fasting just completely takes marriage away or something. It doesn't. Lowering gaze doesn't. Getting married once, twice doesn't. I'm serious. Depends on your own level of interest too. But there's no like such absolute thing that you would feel, even if you have like two wives. It doesn't mean that you can't be attracted to a third one, like a third female. Did that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Potential wife hides her infertility and lies about it, it would be haram, right?
Yes. I mean, lying is haram on its own, right? Yeah.
But like, if she just hides it,
sorry?
If she hides her infertility,
yeah,
would that still be haram?
Yeah.
But
what do you mean by that?
Like she knows that she's infertile,
yeah,
right? And she's gonna have problems bearing children, and she doesn't let the potential husband know.
Yeah,
that would be haram.
That will fall under like just deceiving someone, right? So like when غشنا فليس منا, based on the other hadith, it comes in whoever deceives us or cheats us is not from us. That is obviously again not literal. Maybe you don't go outside the full Islam, but it's not permitted. But the reason why I keep on connecting it to these things is because there's no such necessity that you have to mention every single thing. There are a lot of details that are just unnecessary. You shouldn't be mentioning them, especially if there was like some tahab that happened. Right? If someone was interested in a female or a female was interested in a male, and then they just moved on and they wanted to get married to someone else, and there's no way they would come in contact, it makes sense for, or there's multiples, let's say, or it was very short-lived, right? Like unimportant, but it was there. No sin was committed, anything. There's no obligation for the male or the female to mention that, right? You have to give them a list of like, yes.
Yeah. I want to follow up. Would it invalidate the nikah if she lied about something so?
Invalidate the nikah about just lying? No. Nikah does not get invalidated through this. But he can divorce her if he feels that that's one of the things that I was looking for. It would be hard to prove that he's sinful for divorcing her. I mean, there has to be a reason, right? And not being inclined towards, we will come, inshallah, we'll cover hadith, through which I will show that even if you're not physically attracted to your partner, there is a possibility to separate.
Mention like if it's sinful to divorce, but isn't divorce acceptable?
Yeah, I'm saying the person would not be sinful.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Person the only time, I would say that it's like someone's haqq is being taken away from them through the divorce, but that will again be through external factors. Yeah. It's hard to prove that divorce in itself is a sin. It's not, especially in light of the hadith that we covered. Right? The other hadith that's mentioned, that is the most disliked thing to Allah Ta'ala is divorce. That does not signify that it's impermissible. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? I'm not sure if there's the female side of the questions. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's one of the previous hadiths. If you can go back to, I think it was the fourth one, where you were referring to the rights and the responsibilities that a husband has on his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was this one. And you mentioned something that, community where the wife has an obligation to help her husband fulfill his rights to his parents, not directly, indirectly through managing his wealth. Correct?
Yeah. Can you repeat that part again? Sorry.
Yeah. So in the case that you mentioned where the wife, part of her responsibilities of taking care of the husband's wealth is to be mindful that, let's say he has X amount of wealth. How can he manage his affairs in the marriage as well as take care of his responsibilities outside of the marriage?
There is a possibility. Yeah. There are a lot of specifics that are thrown in there, right? So it has to be scenario by scenario. Like you look at it and then you understand it. You cannot, the accountability is definitely there, but there could be excuses that are used by people that won't be know. Or, we thought that this person had other sources of providing that we didn't know that they did that much at that time or anything of that sort. But there is definitely a strong possibility that would happen because the accountability is attached. It's not like a free-for-all sort of thing. That it's none of my concern. It will relate to that. So the man of the zawj, you're supposed to be responsible of that as well. So the woman is responsible for her husband's wealth. What does that mean? It's what we're expanding on, right? So his spending is definitely related to it because that's what man is for. So whatever is her right, it's understandable. She might be rewarded if she forgoes a few of her rights, and the husband's able to fulfill other obligations through that, right? But that's just getting rewarded for it. So if you flip it, conversely, you can understand that maybe where you could have stopped yourself and it was not a right for you to have that spending done in that venture, right, or whatever he spent on. He could have spent on the other side, and maybe they talked about it, and she's like, I don't care, and he just feels like pressured, and he does it. That's just as من دل على خير فله أجر فاعله. Some people know have mentioned that it can also be inversely understood that whoever does dalal ala shar, even though it's not explicit, but it's possible for someone to pressurize someone to do something that is wrong, and they would be falling into sin as well. So when the accountability will be attached with your husband's wealth, it is understandable that you will be held accountable for wherever he spent wrongly. But if you're disconnected, then you're not. Right? I'm just expanding on this. A woman is responsible for her husband's mal. So one scenario, let's say, there are a lot of scenarios that are coming out of it, right? One very obvious one is that, when he's not home, his wealth is there, she protects it. She's responsible for it. She doesn't steal from it. She doesn't spend from it without his permission. If she ends up doing it, then there are also hadith that discuss that as well. But generally speaking, we would consider it to be protected, right? Then again, in terms of spending too, is it applicable to say, yeah, it is possible to understand that it would be applicable to, pressuring your husband to spend in certain places where he would not spend. But first and foremost, he would receive from us. Any obligation whatsoever, any nafaqah he has. Does that make sense? You just have to be, the ba'i and intervene. Let's say, let me say, not even like rights that relate to others. She can actually do something like, she makes you spend. She takes you somewhere like eat, and you spend you just travel 200 there. $200, only not 200, right? 200, 300 or something. And then when there's time to like pay for something that is mandatorily attached to her, right? So like her sukna, her rent, or the rent of the place, or providing her with a place. That's it, right? And you go like, well, you know, I don't have rent money. Can I borrow some from you? And she was like, why don't you have rent money? It's like, we could spend $300 there, but you know, for you. I was like, that's not my concern. And that is actually not her concern. He's like, I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? So yeah, possibly, like, you know, you say like some accountabilities might not like you're responsible for it, but like whether it leads to sin or not, still debatable. But it generally falls under that. Yeah.
Question I want to get to specifically on the flip side. So me as a husband, where it says the leader is the one responsible for people and he is accountable for those he is responsible.
That's not about the husband. It's about a public figure.
Okay.
So first, but about the husband is the man, the one that follows. Yeah, for the people of his home.
Okay. So the one where it says he's accountable for them.
Yeah.
To what degree is that accountability? So is it the responsibility that she has to other people? Am I also accountable for that as well in helping her in fulfilling that?
No, you're not. Just straight up answer. It's all considered tabarruk. Anything that's done by the husband is from the obligations of the female. It's considered tabarruk. She's an independent person. I'm serious. But let's say that if you were to do some sort, you were to exercise a right that prevents her from doing it, then you will be sinful. So let's say that she can earn, and to earn, separate discussion about like to earn. Let's say that she has to go outside, but you're like, well, you can't go outside. The husband says that you can't go outside, forbid you from leaving. So, okay, but it doesn't make sense for you to forbid her from leaving and also from, or let's say that working or anything, or she's not able to work and make that money. Does that make sense? Yeah, like it doesn't make sense that you were stopped her from doing this, right? So then you might be sinful for the fact that you just put her in a dilemma. She has these financial responsibilities, and or she needs to take care of something, and you're preventing that. She can independently have responsibilities. You don't have to connect to the family necessarily. Let's say that she owned a business on her own. Is that not a possibility, right? And it just didn't work out. And now the people she employed, they want their money back, or she just borrowed money from someone before she was struggling. That's her obligation. It's non-obligatory on the husband to pay her debt. Just as in the opposite of it. Does that make sense? Like it's she has like her nafaqa, like what she spends, and that's also defined. And sukna and etc. Like you know, her living, and her spending, etc. But not her debts. She's not responsible. He's not responsible for her debts.
So if she has prior debts and you restrict her from paying off those debts, you will be sinful for that.
From restrict her from paying her debts.
From allowing her to repay her debts.
From her own money, 100%. Because it's mandatory on her to pay her debt, and you're preventing her to do something mandatory. I was talking about from his own money. Yeah.
So that's her own responsibility.
It's her responsibility.
It's not my concern.
And vice versa. Like it's not 100%. That's a lot more clear to people because they consider the man to be like the guy who just keeps on like spending, right? But there's no responsibility on him either. Both sides, there's no responsibility. Yeah. We'll come to that in the following hadith when we get more into the rights of it. That's more related to like, is that right established or not for the husband? Inshallah, and you know, like violating that is equal to a sin or not. Both to like, you know, in-laws, etc. Yeah.
Is it permissible for a man to divorce his wife if she can't bear children?
We'll discuss that in the divorce scenarios, inshallah. Right now, my focus was like, divorcing in and of itself is not considered too bad. As for the scenarios, which ones are considered to be disliked by God, or the most disliked by God, what does that mean? and etc. Like, but yeah, sorry.
I have another question. You spoke about say if a wife, her first husband dies or abandons, or divorces the man is not out of the picture, and she has a child with the second husband, her new husband, has no responsibility over that child.
I mentioned that, right?
But
I did mention that.
yes,
Yeah.
but I don't know, so if he's giving her money and it's still like a very young child, like where's the child go? If he doesn't-
I did say that, they're not living together though. Yeah. But yeah.
But, my question is like, if it's a young child, then where does the child go if he doesn't want that child to be in his house?
But she wants to provide for that.
That's not the man's responsibility.
No, it's not.
But what if it's vice versa? What if it's the man's children and he marries another wife? She
And,
doesn't.
and she?
Like if it's the man who has 2 children, for example, and the new wife that he has, she has no children. What's her responsibility to those children?
No responsibility at all.
She has no
Responsibility.
responsibility.
There's no. Sorry.
No, because the woman is responsible for her husband's home and his children. So that's his children, even if it's not from their marriage.
Yeah, no, not from like necessarily thing for the husband's like children necessarily. Like his own children that are not from thing, right? So she's not responsible for them.
So she's not
Like, I
responsible.
mean, responsibility when I'm saying that is in like, okay, when they're there and that's something that belongs to him, protects them, etc. But I don't mean like responsibility in the sense that I hope we don't get lost in the words, right? Let's say they live together, the kid's there too, the child, as a human being, she will be responsible, and something that belongs to her husband, she's responsible. But as an involved person, and particularly related to their marital rights, it's only concerning the child that she has given birth to. That's why I mentioned that, well, she has to realize that this is the husband's child, right? So she has certain obligations related to the child, and it's the husband's child. Two, I mean, physically or literally, biologically, it's both theirs child, right? But Islamically, it's the husband's. Does that make sense? Like only the nisbah, the attribution was towards the male, but it's actually talking about the husband and all of his things, etc. So, the responsibility in the sense of like, let's say like anything that relates to like wealth, and that's what I'm talking about, right? But general responsibility that relates to anyone who's living at home, right? It's definitely there, because the husband's going to be unhappy about it. It makes sense or not? So let's say that we talked about like the finances, what we're talking about. Protecting the husband's things, his wealth, his children, etc. Even if you were to throw like his children from his previous marriage before, that would not talk about finances again. Like taking care of their finances, their debts, for example, or just providing them for certain things. So let's say that if the girl lives with her in-laws and her mother-in-law needs, like, she's tired or something and she needs some assistance. Generally, like, it's not her responsibility. It is not her responsibility. Why would it be like responsibility? It's not mandatory on her. I think I should clarify that. It's not mandatory on her to do that. It's not an obligation. But the husband's not going to be happy about it, right? He's gonna come back and be like, well, what did you do? He's unhappy, and that could be related to anything. But is there any like specific accountability related to? Oh, it's not just the husband; it's actually his mother too. There is no actual legal responsibility or accountability related to that. Does that make sense?
What we're strictly trying to like figure out is like if it's like of course, like if let's say for example your wife is not taking care of your parents or whatever, and then you're not happy with it, that's a separate issue. But like it's her, like if from an Islamic perspective, she has no obligation to do any of that.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We will discuss that though in the Hadiths I'll bring. We'll discuss that. There's no obligation. So.
Can you elaborate on the concept of Baal, like king, like between a king?
The word the Ba'al came?
Are you married? Yeah, my mom actually asked that question. She wanted to elaborate.
So Ba'al is just I was pointing out the fact that the husband is called a husband in the Arabic language, and it is related that the Prophet ﷺ also uses this word for the husband, as it has these significations that connected to it. That is, he is considered to be the master in the relationship. Now, mastery does not mean that you own the person because she's not a slave, right? Mastery means that you can say in the shortest way of explaining it, he's your mentor, right? He's going to mentor her in everything. Like she's supposed to follow him in everything. There's a hadith that will come later on in which the Prophet ﷺ, will mention that as like riwayah connected to something, inshallah, in which he mentioned that your husband is your hell and your husband is your heaven. It's like through him you find Jannah and through him you find Nar. But that's more rights related, right? But when a person has that status, right, that's your master, isn't it? Like you're the leader in the relationship, the mentor in the relationship, that the person is supposed to be followed, the person you're supposed to look up to, the person.
How do you tackle that in this day? That concept itself, like he's the leader, but that's
He can forego that, right? Yeah.
But no, but then like that a lot of times, like especially the time that we're living, this is kind of a concept that's like, no, they're supposed to be equal. There's like partnership and all these kind of concepts. So how would you navigate these issues? Because this is a very real thing in this day and age.
Yeah, that's the point of like, let me give an example. What does a parent do? You have to deal with it. They go like, it is what it is. You cannot really, not even if you were to be like, but people change too, right? There is a possibility, especially in like longer marriages, hopefully so, right? Is that someone you got married to and the way they were the first year is not necessarily the way they're going to be 10 years after that, right? They will grow in a good direction, bad direction, or just different. It could be different. There's a possibility that there's like you guys are more casual, you know, and she goes like, well, you know, I understand the concept. I understood the concept of you being my master, but I kind of feel like we're friends now, right? And that seeps into her decisions as well, and the way she acts with you, and you're wanting something, and then you would come to a point of like, well, you know, she's supposed to listen to it because that's something that we understand from the Hadith of the Prophet, but that's actually challenging my other parts of the relationship, so I can let that break up.
You have to pick
Right?
your battles.
You have to pick your battles, or you have to be poisoned, depending on like what kind of situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like we can't like take one part. You have to look at it holistically. You can't take one part. It's like, well, listen, the husband's the master. It's like, yeah, I got it. But it's really hard for her to perceive that. She didn't see her parents like that. She didn't see her, or let's say that, you know, before she got married, she used to see her brother's relationship, her sister's relationships, her friends, everything, right? And they're like, well, I understand that. She would be like, I understand that, but I don't want this. I want you to be more casual. I want a friend in you. There's nothing wrong in foregoing that way. Like, you know, like, but when you exercise it, it will be mandatory for her to follow you, like the husband. This is the dynamic that needs to be maintained. She doesn't, then it's any other violation that happens elsewhere, right? It's mandatory to let it know. I mean, like if it's mandatory for the son to follow his father, but does every son do that? No, everyone knows that, right? Man to man, right? Like as in like between men, I mean. So, but what does the father do? He picks his battles, right? He goes like, okay, you know, in our like context is what I mean. He's not gonna be like, well, this is what I've said, that's it. It works for a while, but like when the child's like a bit more grown, after that they go like, that does not make sense, you know that, right? Like, cause like, okay, you know, so the things sometimes like fall apart, but it's completely your own like choice, to be honest. There's nothing wrong in exercising your right and going in a direction where he would say, well, it ended up in divorce. It's like the guy's happy. It is what it is from the girl's side. And if the guys go like, well, you know what, there were certain goals that I had, but I couldn't do it because I couldn't fulfill those goals because, you know, she doesn't want to do this, right? Let me give you an example. Like someone wants to move to a different country and do something. And the girl's like, I'm absolutely not moving there. So now does he go like, well, you know, do I end my marriage and just pursue my goals? A lot of people are going to be like, well, I have other goals that are more important. That is, you know, the well-being of my children and, you know, like having a good relationship, not have fights every single day that's going to affect my mental health. etc. So I might as well just give up on this, right? On that a dream of his, but that might slowly, like reveal itself in his own demeanor. There is a possibility that he might just become more and more bitter and have resentment, right? So it's the wife's responsibility. There's like a lot that can be said about it, but in terms of like obligations, the man is like, if you were to just say, okay, what are the rules? Can you tell me the rules? Like, well, who's place? Like, how do we? What's the position of this person? What's the position of that person? So the position in every hadith that will come, inshallah, in this text, or like these are the ones that we cover in this course, you would see that it's always the husband's rights are established over or above the female, that she's the one who's supposed to follow the man. Especially the hadith that comes, no one disputes the meaning of it, even though the chains of transmission of it are debatable. Which the Prophet mentioned to a female that your husband is through whom you go to heaven, and through him you also go to hell. It could be, you go, okay, as a partner, right? Not just like violating their rights, is like the woman actually follows the man. And also the fuqaha, the experts of jurisprudence, they mentioned that if there's a conflict among the children. And Ahmed Ali Sa'afuri has mentioned this in his Hashia al-Bukhari as well, is that if there's, that whenever there's a conflict between the husband and the wife in terms of the children following one of the either, then they're supposed to follow the father. And he brings the hadith that, the mother and thumma man, like who has like more right over me, the mother, and then after her, whom, the mother, etc. He says in light of this hadith as well, this talks about care, it doesn't talk about the right of having command. So the husband has command. That's what it means, like ba'al. Not necessarily that's why the word was used here, but that was the context. Like the Arab culture that was incorporated in Islam as well was that the husband is considered to be the one who has command in the relationship. And it makes sense because it's not about superiority. Understand this, please. It's not about superiority. It's about roles. Right? A woman can actually be superior in the eyes of Allah than the man, her husband, and the eyes of the people too. Right? And she still has to follow her husband. And then obviously the discussion of like what she wants out of it.
There's also Arabic and linguistics here.
Yeah. Just the fact that the Quran, the Hadith, the word ba'al is used multiple times, which literally just means master. It's translated as husband, but literally means master. Actually, more literally means the one who's worshipped.
For context matter.
Yeah. The word is what. Sorry. Is it? So some people had questions in the chat. The ones who are attending online, the hadith, the most disliked permissible thing about the talaq will be discussed specifically. Yes, it will be discussed specifically later, inshallah. Brother Ahmed also has another question. If a mother's child from a different male is not the responsibility of the husband, then how does the mother take care of her child, etc.? We answer the question in the hadith that the shepherd's man would be asked regarding what specifically. All the rights that are related to guiding the female in the right direction in general, and the ones that are specifically mentioned about the obligations that the husband has related to the female, like providing for her, providing not in general, providing those specific things. It's not mandatory for you to buy a car for your wife. Simple as that. Right? It's not mandatory for you to buy some expensive pair of shoes for her. But like shoes itself, for her to live her life, yeah, that makes sense. The social dilemma that you have of like, what do you do in this situation? That's no different from like you having your obligation of like, okay, well, I'm gonna have salah and I come across this person on my work situation, and then you kind of like balance things. That's what it is. You're dealing with people. People are different. Some people could be inclined towards other things. So, like for example, what would you say about a couple that has different backgrounds in terms of their religious leanings? The marriage is valid, and it'll be completely fine for them to stay married too. So let's say the one is yeah, this will be interesting. The wife is Ash'ariyya and the husband's Athari, right? Let's go with that. Those two first, right? Well, there's a point that might have like certain conflicts and some distasteful like comments too, but that could be just like them. It totally depends on how they handle it, right? It could be just like, okay, yeah, we can just agree to disagree. Let's just go out and grab dinner now. We can just talk about it like over food, or their personal temperament could be like, how did you say this about Sheikh Ibn Baz, right? And that just makes them dislike her, and then that keeps going in a wrong direction and separate because they grew apart, right? So it's like it's a matter of like what people are bringing in from their own lives in the relationship and how you deal with them. Maybe you can move on. Maybe you can like, well, my views were slightly different before in terms of tolerance, but now they're different. Or maybe it goes like, well, I got a lifelong partner who I can discuss these things with. Maybe you're like, maybe one of them cares more than the other, right? So that's not really about accountability. That's about like how you live your life generally. You just gotta be smart. Okay. But accountability that relates to the husband and the wife is in terms of their obligations per se. Okay, that was the last question, I think. Any other questions in the group? The Q&A session deep talking. Okay, so okay. All right. So we conclude here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Also, if anyone has any questions, they can ask them in the following class too. Right? But we'll definitely have to look at the time for the Q&A. Yeah, so
You think 1 hour is enough for this class?
I think anything that's about marriage is
A lot of females are complaining that like they can't hear and like they want to have if they can have like a lecture type style like separation but in the same
okay.
area.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
They couldn't hear
Except
today.
so they're here, but they obviously want to. This is like a lecture style.
Yeah.
And so they want to participate in these question Q&A. That you can
Yeah.
sit in the middle, and then the guys can be on one side and the females can be on the other side. That's
set the divider.
Yeah.
yeah. That's what they want basically.
Okay.
We can set the divider there next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It'll be nice because we can probably have a healthy.
Yeah, exactly. They might have questions that you might not hear about.
No.
Only through the text. They can't get there.
Yeah.
Okay, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
في ذكر حال أشرف البرية صلى عليه الله ربي وعلى صحابه وآله ومن تلا اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد